Good morning and welcome to another Talk Wildlife video. Today I have with me Nick Moran, who is ex-bird track organiser at the BTO and also now training manager at the BTO. So good morning, Nick.
Morning.
How are you?
I'm very well, thanks.
First question I've got to ask you, given that you live basically on Nunnery Lakes Reserve, is how many birds have you already seen this morning?
Rough count, about 60, although I did miss a cuckoo that everybody else seemed to hear.
60?
Yeah.
I've had a couple of sparrows. Although I'm quite excited because yesterday I think I found a house sparrow nest in the garden, which I haven't got a big garden, and I was delighted just to get them feeding in my garden because it's taken a few years to get anything in the garden. But I think I found a house sparrow nest, so I'm really chuffed about that.
That's great because, I mean, house sparrows are strange. On our estate, they're down the bottom end, maybe 300-400 meters away from our garden, but they're rarely in our garden, and I don't even hear them around this end. Certainly not every week. Yeah. So yeah, they're so in such tiny little pockets. So that's good news.
Yeah, so if I get distracted, it's because I'm facing the window, and I'm just keeping an eye on where they are. But anyway, right, slight digression there. So we're going to talk about something that is not new, but is because I think a lot of people are based at home at the moment. It's started to pick up. There's a lot of interest in it at the moment. And that is nocmig. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I knew about it and I'd obviously seen it on tweets and things like that, but then read your amazing article in the BTO News and thought, well, it'd be great to have a chat with you about it because it's probably the ideal time for people to get involved in it, given that, you know, we are restricted to how much we can go out and do actual bird watching. So I think the best bet is if you can start off just by giving a little bit of background to sort of what it is, and then we'll talk about the type of equipment you need, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail about how it works.
Great. So nocmig is, first of all, it's an abbreviation for nocturnal migration or nocturnal migration recording. And it's, like you say, it's not a new thing. It's been around for several decades. There's a guy in the States who's run something called Old Birds for a number of years, recording what they call in the States nocturnal flight calls, NFCs. We tend to use the term nocmig. And that's been around for several decades. More recently, over this side of the pond, the Sound Approach pioneered a lot of nocturnal flight call recording, nocmigging. And it's been places like Poole Harbour, which is where the Sound Approach are based. They've been doing it now for probably upwards of 15 years. But you're absolutely right. It's really taken off in the last few years. And that I think some of that's down to social media. People can hear from others what's going on. So when it's a big thrush night in autumn, in October, people will be saying, oh, there are redwings on the move, and birders will go outside and listen. Whereas in the past, it might have, you might have had to wait to read about that a few days, weeks, or even months later.
Yeah.
And then the actual, the other bit of it, the technology, whilst that isn't new either, most of us are just using fairly standard sound recording devices, which have been on the market for decades. I think what's happened now is a bit like cameras, people are starting to get a really good idea of what works well for this particular purpose. And there are, half a dozen makes and models that people quickly reference and pick up on and go, oh yeah, that'll do the job for me for what I want for nocmigging.
Yeah. So speaking of equipment, because I mean, as a birder, I have heard various things in the dark during migration, especially redwing. I think redwing is probably the most famous amongst bird watchers for what you can hear. Right? You always hear redwing. But if you're going to take it that step further, so rather than just go and sit outside and listen, when you say equipment, what are you actually using? What are you using?
You've hit on a really important point, which is nocmig itself can be with the naked ear. You can just go outside and listen, and depending how good you are at staying awake, you could, if you wanted to, stay awake all night listening. And I know some people will sit out for hours, particularly if they're desperate to hear a particular species with the naked ear and not on a recording for their garden list or whatever. But for those of us like me who like their sleep and who can't face the hours of freezing cold, and not actually that much on many nights, it's not a constant stream of birds, certainly not where we are, 40, 50 miles inland. So you're going to need some kind of recording device. And then the idea being that you don't sit through and listen to all the recordings, but you simply look at the recordings on screen, which we'll come back to in a bit. So in terms of what I'm using, I use a handheld sound recorder, a Zoom H4n Pro, which looks like that. I think they retail at about 180 quid at the moment. So not much more than or the same as a fairly standard digital camera. But I chose that because I wanted something I could also use when I was out in the field birding. So in the autumn, I have that clip to my either my scope pack or my rucksack or whatever, recording all the time, so that if and when that red-throated pipit flies over, I've got it. You know, I don't have to think, oh, I'm pretty sure, or oh, I've heard a red throat, but I'm never going to be able to prove it. So I chose it with that dual purpose in mind. Yeah. What I would say to people thinking about getting started with, you know, taking the step beyond just sitting in the garden with a G&T, is consider something cheap to see if it's going to be for you. If you're in a place where there really isn't that much happening, or you haven't got the time or patience to sift through hours of nothing, for that one, song thrush call perhaps, then you might not want to invest 180, 200 quid. So a good way to start is with something like a USB mic. You can pick up one of those for 10 or 20 quid, hang that out the window from your laptop, and then you're away, you are recording. Another cheap route for a lot of people is smartphone. If you've got a place you can leave that outside safely, both from people who might wander off with it and from the elements, then a smartphone will do the trick. Or you can clip in an external mic to a smartphone. Similarly, like a USB mic into a laptop, you could do the same with, there's various things available online. So there are really cheap alternatives to have a go to sort of see if it's for you.
Yeah. And so that's the hardware. Is there any specific software you need?
The two main things that most nocmiggers use are Audacity, which is entirely free. You download it to your computer, and then once you've got it set up, it's pretty easy to use. There's a bit of fiddling around with the settings, and it's designed for people recording music. So it's got all sorts of fancy ways of having multiple tracks and various other things. But in fact, the bits you need for nocmig are fairly easy to find and fairly straightforward. The other one that people use is Raven Light. So that's a product from Cornell Lab of Ornithology. There's a pro version, which I think is something like $400 a year, but you can get plenty out of the free version, the Raven Light it's called. I've never used that though. I've done everything I need to through Audacity. Right,
that's cool. And what I think we'll do now is I'll share screen. So this is always the bit where it could go disastrously wrong, but I'll share screen and I'll just show a couple of sort of slides, just so that people can see what the audio recording looks like. We can't play the recording itself, but I will put a link up to your nocmig site so people can have a listen, because it doesn't pick it up very well on Skype, and I don't want people to have to try and strain. But what I'll do is if you just bear with me a sec, and I'll just share screen. Right, so talk us through this. What am I seeing here?
So what this is a spectrogram, or sonogram it's sometimes called, which is a graph with on the vertical axis the frequency in kilohertz, and on the horizontal axis, the time. So what you've got there is around 5 seconds worth of recording, and it allows you to visualize the sound. And that might sound a bit obscure if you're trying to identify things by the sounds they're making. Why would you want to see those sounds? But the key reason for that is, like I touched on before, if you've got 8, 9, 10 hours worth of overnight recording, depending on the time of year and how long the nights are, trying to listen through all that, you'd need that amount of time to listen through it.
Yeah.
If you can visualize the sounds, though, you can flip through it much, much faster, just scrolling across the screen, and then pick out anything that you don't recognize. And the great thing about it is because many vocalizations are fairly similar, or a given species vocalizations look the same each time they make them, you get to recognize the common ones. So you get to recognize red wing calls very, very quickly. And it would only be a slightly weird looking red wing call or something else in that frequency range that you might then stop and actually play whilst you're working through. So by being able to visualize the sounds, you're making the processing, the searching through much, much faster. And the key thing is when you're actually listening to them, and this would apply to anybody listening to any of the links that you put up, is you've got to get a pair of headphones, even cheap phone ones like I use, because the recordings are often quite faint. And that's another reason why looking at this spectrogram is a good idea, because you might be able to see things on the spectrogram which, if you were listening through, they might not have actually stood out to you.
Yeah. So there we've got a little grebe, and then here we've got a water rail, and you can see that there's a distinct difference between the two. But
yes, if you go back to the little grebe for a sec, Alan.
Yeah.
So you've got here what we call overtones. So there's two levels of frequency, but our ears wouldn't necessarily be able to pick that up. What they would pick up is a slightly wavering nature. So you can see the line is slightly jagged.
Yeah. And
also it rises. And on top of that, the highest intensity, the most energy, or the darkest line is certainly for the first call, is the top one at around between 4 and 4.5 kilohertz. So it's quite a high pitch call. It's rising and it's got a wavering quality to it. So you've got that's a scream like call.
Yeah.
In contrast.
Yeah, because here you've got the water rail. So I'll let you talk us through that in one sec. But I think a question that I'll ask you once you've talked us through this is, clearly, if I see a bird in the garden and I'm new to birding, I go to a bird guide and I have a look at a picture, and then I have a look at the bird, and then I match them up and I go, that's one of them. Is there such a thing for these? Because clearly, if I was new to it and I came to that, I wouldn't have the faintest idea what it was, unless, is there something that would give somebody guidance to say, well, because it might be that you're hearing an unusual call. I mean, a red wing, fine, people know what a red wing sounds like, but something like, one of the waders that goes over that might make an alarm call or something, or a contact call. Is it something where you can actually go, right, okay, well, I can compare this, and then that'll help me sort of define what it is?
The short answer, unfortunately, is no. The longer answer is there are various things that can help. So one of the things that a lot of people are using at the moment, and I think that's partly because it's new and or new to many people and growing rapidly, is social media and just asking experts or people who've been there before. So, for example, the other little grebe call starts off with 2 quite high-pitched pips, and then followed by a series of sounds that are really strikingly similar to Wimbrel. And we get quite often people have recorded what they think is a Wimbrel, and it turns out to be a little grebe, believe it or not. So things like that once you've done one season's worth of recording, you've probably got enough experience to be able to help people out. So that happens quite a bit.
Yeah,
we've tried to summarize some of the common confusion species or common nocturnal migrants that might be very uncommon in your garden during the day. So water rail and little grebe being great examples, moorhen and coot being other two. We've summarised those on the nocmig.com website, and we're going to try and build on that as well, so that there are more of the species that you might hear on nocturnal migration for people to refer to. And then I guess the other place is Xenocanto, which allows you to search by type. So you could, if you've got, the problem is with Xenocanto is you're going to need some idea of what species it is. So you're going to have an inkling that it's a crake or rail, or an inkling that it's a heron, bittern, egret type of call. But if you have got an inkling of what it's likely to be, and you go into Xenocanto, then you can filter by nocturnal flight call, and then actually compare with other people's recordings overnight, which are often quite different to the diurnal calls. So those are the kind of three main resources. Other people, our website and one or two others where people are starting to share some of the common confusion species, and then Xenocanto by filtering.
Yeah, and I know you've sort of mentioned it, but you have got social media and you have got the website, and I know, having sort of known you and Simon for a long time, who works with you on this, that your passion for this and your eagerness to help people, if they put it up, I know full well that you guys would get back to them and help them out.
But yeah, there are lots of other people. If you use the hashtag nocmig on Twitter, somebody will pick it up, and if it's a fairly common call for nocmiggers, then it'll get identified fairly quickly. The other thing I would say on the whole identification side is, part of the fascination of it is trying to work out what these crazy sounds are that you hear overnight, or that you record overnight, that you wouldn't have picked up on in the day. I didn't even know the little grebe scream or the water rail. I knew the water rail chips, but they make another sound, a sort of whirring sound in flight, which I wouldn't have even picked up as water rail a couple of years ago. And then I guess the last point on identification is lots of people are asking about automated sound recognition that not only detects where a sound is made in a long period of effective silence or just background noise, but also starting to classify that by what species made it. And that's really difficult for sound, probably more so than for images. So there's already software out there like Cornell's Merlin program, which do a great job of recognizing birds from images. But the problem is with sounds is partly you've got more variation within a given species, but also you've got lots of things vocalizing in the same frequency range, and other sounds that are non-avian that are coming in that frequency range as well. So mammals and insects and people and road noise, somebody slamming a door, all these sorts of things are quite hard for automated software to pick up. It's slightly easier at night actually than it is during the day. Trying to set up classifiers for nocturnal identifying nocturnal calls is further forward than doing the same for diurnal song and calls, because there's less background noise. There's fewer, usually or often, your nocturnal flight call is in isolation, and there's especially if you're in a fairly quiet part of the country. Whereas during the day, there's much more going on, much more sound, much more background noise. So it's much harder for software to pick out and identify particular noises, but it's not there yet. It's a work in progress there.
All right. Oh, that's good. We'll look forward to that one. And now then, just for people that think, well, I live in the middle of the country, I live in a sort of quite urban area, nothing's going to be flying over my house. Now, I can vouch for the fact that things do, because I've heard them when I've been out in the night. What I want to show next was one that did actually shock me, because I didn't know this. And I did sort of accidentally show it earlier on, but we'll come back to it now, which is this one. Now, it's not so much the fact that it's a common scoter, right? That's fine. It's a common scoter, and they do fly around at night, and that's fine. But it's where this was recorded that struck me. So do you want to give us some background to that?
So this is one of Simon's recordings, which he made in Cambridge. So not a classic spot for seeing or hearing commons go to, or so you might think. What's become apparent, and again, the sound approach started to uncover this 10 years or so back. But what's become apparent is that there's a quite clear movement of common scoter in springtime, in March or early April, from the west side of the UK across towards the North Sea and onwards towards their breeding grounds. And this is an overland crossing, and it seems to be on quite a broad front. So people are recording, I think it was the 31st of March and then the 1st of April, those nights at around that time this year, when of course we were locked down and everybody was at home. But there was a huge effort made to listen and to sound record, and common scoter were recorded over a vast part of certainly central England and parts of northern England as they moved across from the west side to the east. So one of those things that could quite easily have gone under the radar without nocmig, and I think that's one of the really exciting things, what it can reveal about species that we wouldn't, like you say, you wouldn't necessarily have expected it. Certainly wouldn't have expected it in Cambridge. I even had a flock over Thetford, which was my first. This is the first year that I've recorded common scoter over here. So yeah, exciting stuff.
So if you want to get common scoter on your garden list, that's the way to do it. If
you want to get common scoter on your garden list, I'm afraid you might have to wait either till the autumn or next year now. I think there's probably still some on the move, but it was, like lots of migration, the windows for movement of species, particularly those where there's no risk of sort of confusion with local species. So by that I mean birds that are not going to be around in that area anyway. Common scoter compared with something like coot, for example. Coot could be flying around from local water bodies, from the nearest lake or canal or whatever, pretty much right through from February through May, June time. Whereas common scoters, they're a migrant and they're only going to be going over if they're migrating from A to B. And it seems that those things that are just migrating at night rather than flying around a local territory are confined to relatively small windows. So, I mean, ortolan bunting is another classic example of something that nocmig really started to cast a new light on. And that's very much the sort of last couple of weeks of August into the first week or so of September. Again, a pretty narrow window, and as you'd expect when you think about the arrival and departure times of other species too.
Sure. So before we move on to sort of recording as in records, what is the most unusual one you've recorded over your garden?
Good question. I think there's only one or two things that I've never actually seen on the Nunnery Lakes, which my garden fronts onto. The one that stands out over all of them is probably turnstone. So that's in the Brecks, we don't really have a lot of good turnstone habitat, funnily enough. We don't have many big gravel pits or areas that might attract them. So it's not like somewhere like Grafham Water where, the odd turnstone or knot or what have you might show up. So that was one that Magnus Robb very kindly helped me to identify, because I was at a loss. I knew it was a wader, but I just couldn't quite place the call. I think probably after that, the surprises were the regularity of things which I've seen on the reserve, but as extreme rarities. So sandwich tern and bittern are the two obvious ones. I've had sandwich tern once on the reserve by sight during the day at this time of year, actually mid-April. But once I started recording, I was getting them in August, presumably young birds starting to disperse and cutting across East Anglia 2 or 3 times in the same year, having had one sight record in a decade. And then similarly with bittern, we haven't had a bittern on the reserve since the cold winters of around sort of 2011, 2012. and yet every spring, if I do enough recording, if my nocmig effort is high enough, I'll get bitten. I've had bitten this year twice. Year before last, when I was doing it quite regularly at around this time. So yeah, I think it's what it shows about some of the species that you know are probably around, or you've seen once or twice, but just how regular they actually are as flyovers. I'm still waiting for the ortolan.
Yeah, you and me both.
Yeah.
So just with regards to actually, because you sort of touched earlier on about the people finding out new things about bird calls and bird movement at night. So for those that are doing it, clearly if I go out bird watching, I can, well, I do use Bird Track. Other ones are available, just not as good as Bird Track. I go out and Bird Track when I go out bird watching. How can people record this that will help science? Can they use Bird Track, for instance?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the answer is yes, of course. It's like many things, it's kind of what you want to get out of it. So for me, as I've kind of touched on already, the data, the discovery of what's happening and putting that into context is really valuable. So for me to do that, Bird Track was the natural option to start with, because if I see a peregrine on my way to the office, I'll stick that in as a casual record. If I sound record a bittern going over, I'd stick that in as a casual record too. But actually, if you get into a more structured approach, if you catch the nocmig bug, and you're doing it on a regular basis, by regular I would mean at least once a week during the key migration periods. So say March through May, and again August through October, November. Then we'd recommend using Trektellen. So that's a Dutch-based website that was originally set up for Vismig. But Gerard Troost, who's works for Sovon and is a close collaborator with BTO, he's adapted it largely on Simon Gilling's advice, actually, to include more features and functionality for nocmig, for structured nocturnal migration recording. And that means you can put in the time periods for the whole recording period, or even break it down into shorter periods. You can put in the times of particular calls. You can put in the number of calls made by one individual, if you know that it was one individual, or an estimate of the number of individuals involved. The latter is really tricky. So if you've got a flock of widgeon going over, I've tried this, it's really difficult to say. It's not like looking up and going, yeah, I can estimate there's 20, there's 200, there's 2,000 birds in that flock. But you can get some indication of whether it's a lone bird, whether it's a handful of birds, or whether it's quite a sizable flock. And Trek allows you to put that in too. And the nice thing about Trektellen is that it's feeding into Bird Track on a nightly basis. Right. So the data are available for BTO scientists, other analysts and researchers who are wanting to look at this information. So yeah, Trek is a great place to put or Trektellen, I should say, is a great place to put your standardized recording. We put together a protocol about a year and a half ago, which is on the nocmig website and various other places, just giving a bit more guidance around that. So for people who are interested in making the most out of the data and getting into it on a sort of really analytical way and structured way, it gives some guidance about how to do that. Right.
Well, what I'll do is I'll link to that from this interview. So on YouTube underneath, I'll put a link through to that. I won't put a link through to the other site. I'll let them come to yours so that they can get an understanding and then go to that, because your link's already there. And we've mentioned Bird Track, and before we go, I know I did want to talk to you about nocmig. Before we go, I just want to touch on your old job, and that's basically because this week, I think it was, there's been a sort of a launch with Bird Track, which certainly I think will excite a lot of people. It certainly excites me, although I don't know which of my patches to choose, but so yeah, I will share screen just while we talk about this, just so that people can see the home page. So if I can do this without losing you again, just bear with me a sec. So, who said old men can't work technology, eh? Look at that. Right, I haven't cut you off then. Right, no. So the bit I'm referring to is that bit at the top, the My Patch. So
yeah, so what you're looking at here is a user's interface in BirdTrack. So once you've set up an account and logged in, you actually now have the option to put different widgets on your homepage. So if you want to see, for example, a selection of reporting rate graphs like that tier 1 in the middle there, or a calendar of how often you've been out, like the one on the right hand side of the screen there, or indeed the league tables, you can do that. And the new one that you're talking about there, Allan, is this My Patch, which gives you an indication of how much effort you've been able to put in your local area. And it's one of the reasons that it's so sort of attractive right at the moment is that, of course, most of us, if not all of us, are restricted to our local areas. And BirdTrack is one of the things you can do without transgressing the government guidelines. So if you're out for a walk anyway, or you've got, or you go out in your garden for a while and want to record the birds that you're seeing and hearing both in the garden and beyond, then BirdTrack gives you the opportunity to do that. So it's a great way to continue birding and continue recording birds in spite of the restrictions. What we're not asking people to do, of course, from a BTO point of view, is to go out specifically to survey birds, because we feel that would be a step too far. But if you're outside anyway, if you're on your daily exercise, BirdTrack's there, and you can certainly put the records in. And the My Patch feature allows you to track your progress, if you like, at a very local level. The other survey I'm going to plug right now is Garden Birdwatch, which we were able to offer free. It's never been free before, but in light of the current situation, we worked with the GBW team to be able to offer it free. So if you want to sign up for Garden Birdwatch, you can do it now and it won't cost you a penny. The key difference between, or one of the key differences between Garden Birdwatch and BirdTrack is that it's very much about birds using the resources in your garden. So you can't count the nocmig common scoters in Garden Birdwatch, but you can in BirdTrack. Similarly, if you see some, if away in the distance beyond those house sparrows, Allan, a marsh harrier floats by, you can't count that for Garden Birdwatch, but you can for BirdTrack. Yeah. The other thing with GBW Garden Birdwatch is that it's a weekly high count. So you're looking for a weekly maxima of each species. And it's very much about tracking how birds use our gardens, because gardens are such an important part of the ecosystem across the UK. So that's really the key difference. But both of them are available, and really encourage people to get involved in either or both of them right now, whilst you're stuck in your local area. Yeah,
too right. Do you know, I touched on that with the video I did with Paul a couple of weeks ago, and when we were talking about webs, and it's a really, really good package, good interface, great database, dead easy to use. But what I was going to say in addition to that is it's great to see what comes into your garden and record what comes into your garden, garden and your own patch. I can't talk highly enough about how exciting it is when you get something new on your patch. My patch has been well built on now. My patch I live in Wymondham in Norfolk, in England, for those that might be watching internationally. Right opposite me, we've got a bit of a common. It then went right down to Heatherset, which was probably about 4 mile stretch that I could walk. Now it's just shrunk. I mean, basically the houses. So I've got one little patch of it left opposite, which I've got a circular walk on. But a few years ago, I got a wheat ear on it. It was passing through. It was a juvenile. It landed on the top of the tree. I just happened to be working from home, looked out the office window, and there it was. I ran around the house trying to find a camera that would work. Nothing would. But to record something new on your patch or in your garden is just amazing. It's great fun. It's a real buzz. And even if it's something you might have seen 300 times in different reserves around the country, if you suddenly get it in your garden, that's different. If you get it on your patch, that's different. So yeah, I can highly recommend people go out and bird trap using this new thing, and certainly join Garden Birdwatch. And
as well as the thrill of discovery of new stuff, I'm right with you there. That, you know, the common scoters that I finally got on nocmig just this month, that was brilliant. But alongside that is the patterns. You know, if you're out on your patch or recording in your garden regularly, you'll know, you know, precisely which week reed buntings come into your garden and use the feeders. You know, the last week of March or first week of April before they disperse on their way through. If you're lucky enough to have reed buntings in your garden, I imagine it's around that time. Same with siskins. You know, they don't, in a lot of places, they don't come into the gardens until sort of March time. And on patch, it's just the same, you know, with returning migrants. Down more or less to the day, you know what to expect, and if it's not there, you start getting a bit, you know, a bit twitchy and a bit worried. Is it going to come back? You know, when will it be? Was last year an anomaly because it was here a week earlier? You know, those sort of things I find fascinating. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the sort of beauty of recording birds or recording any wildlife. I mean, you know, I've recently started doing moth trapping, and well, not recently, about 5 years ago, in this house. And, you know, anything like that, when you get something new or something unusual, or even a familiar thing. I mean, I had a brindle beauty moth that was in the house the other day, and it was absolutely fresh as could be. It was just stunning. And I've seen them before. They've always been a little bit worn. This was a brand new, and it looked mint. So, yeah, anything like that is just really amazing. So, right. I'm going to let you get back to Nunnery Lakes. You mean back to work, Alan? It's office day today. Just so people know, when I say Nick get back to Nunnery Lakes, Nick doesn't have to leave his garden to get back to Nunnery Lakes. It literally backs on to Nunnery Lakes. So he's not breaking any restrictions by being able to birdwatch on Nunnery Lakes and add things like kingfisher ×2 to his garden. Yeah, I was pretty fortunate yesterday working on my outside desk. I have to say, yeah, it's times like this when you realise just how lucky you are if you've got a garden like that. But even if you don't, go outside at night, listen up, listen out, even think about putting a recorder out and see what's going over. And I guarantee there'll be something exciting in your garden too. Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Nick. That's good stuff, Alan. I hope people found it interesting. I'm sure they will have done, and I'm sure we'll get a lot of people sort of starting this up because it is exciting. So thank you very much again for your time, and I'll hopefully speak to you in the not too distant. Good. Thanks, Alan. Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. Take care. Bye. Bye.